I did not walk into that Doha suite looking for mercy. I walked in with my country's dignity. We may not have gas, but we have something rarer people who still believe that independence means something.
I did not walk into that Doha suite looking for mercy. I walked in with my country's dignity. We may not have gas, but we have something rarer. People who still believe that independence means something. It began without fanfare. No headlines, no motorcades, just a quiet handshake in a hotel room above the Gulf skyline. A young captain from Burkina Faso uniform, pressed but worn, met with diplomats in tailored suits from one of the richest states on earth, Qatar. To the outside world, it made no sense. Why would the king of natural gas engage with a landlocked African country, fighting to stabilize its economy? But what happened behind closed doors was more than a deal. It was a signal that the balance of global power, long tilted toward the West, was beginning to shift. This isn't just about infrastructure or energy. It's about something deeper. What happens when a so-called poor nation dares to negotiate as an equal? If you still believe in fairness, not just for one people, but for all, then keep watching, because what you're about to hear won't air on the evening news. And yet, it might just change how you see Africa forever. From the outside, it's an unlikely partnership. On one end, Qatar, a sovereign Gulf state, bursting with wealth, exporting liquefied natural gas to the highest bidders, shaping global conversations, from the halls of diplomacy to the FIFA World Cup. On the other end, Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation, facing insurgencies, rebuilding its infrastructure, and redefining its place in the world. What could possibly bring them to the same table? To understand that, you have to know what's happening beneath the surface, not just of this deal, but of Africa itself. In the past, partnerships were handed down from above. Europe set the rules. Washington enforced them. Aid came with conditions. Loans came with lectures. But now a new rhythm is emerging. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, isn't just accepting help, it's choosing partners. And Qatar, with its unique blend of economic ambition and diplomatic agility, saw something most didn't. Not desperation, not poverty, but potential. In 2023, Qatari envoys began appearing quietly in Ouagadougou, a scholarship program here, a medical facility there. At first glance, it looked like philanthropy, but to insiders, it was a scouting mission, a way to test the waters in a region where France's grip was weakening and African voices were rising. You see, Qatar is facing its own kind of pressure. As new energy players like the US, Nigeria, and Mozambique grow their reach, Qatar needs new allies, not just buyers, but bridges. And Burkina Faso, despite lacking natural gas, sits at a critical junction in the Sahel, a region rich in gold, rare minerals, and untapped influence. In Traoré, Qatar saw a partner willing to speak, plainly act decisively, and stand on his own terms. For Burkina Faso, the appeal was clear: investment without interference, infrastructure without indignity, and most of all, a chance to build, not beg. This wasn't charity. It was alignment. And yet, as the world looked away, thinking nothing of this quiet meeting between unequals, something far bigger was taking shape. Not a pipeline, not a contract, but a new kind of conversation, one that might redraw the maps, not with tanks, but with trust. The room was not grand. It was quiet, air-conditioned, filled with tension and possibility. No flag ceremony, no joint press statement, just a table, a few folders, and the hum of a decisions years in the making. Across from each other sat two very different faces of the global South. On one side, Qatar, a monarchy flush with energy wealth, a master of soft power, and a careful player in a world shaped by diplomacy. On the other side, Burkina Faso, led by a young captain turned president, navigating sanctions pressure and isolation with nothing but conviction and clarity. What happened next wasn't a plea. It was a proposition. Traoré didn't ask for aid. He offered terms. That moment, often overlooked in headlines, was the pivot. The point where an African nation no longer negotiated from a position of need, but of leverage. He came to Doha with something rare: credibility among his people. That kind of legitimacy can't be printed on money or manufactured through press releases. It comes from sacrifice, from refusing comfort, from walking the dusty roads with your people and facing the cameras without scripts. Qatar knew that. Unlike leaders who had lost the trust of their citizens long ago, Traoré arrived with moral capital, and in return, he asked not for grants, but guarantees. According to insiders close to the talks, the structure of the agreement was unprecedented in Burkina Faso's history. First, infrastructure, not merely buildings, but strategic corridors. Highways connecting Ouagadougou to coastal trade routes. Power plants, hybrid models of solar and gas to stabilize an erratic national grid. Hospitals and schools. Yes, but also logistics zones, trade hubs, and dry ports to make Burkina Faso more than a consumer, a connector. Second, access. Qatar would receive priority stakes in future mining ventures, particularly in gold and lithium resources increasingly vital to global tech and energy industries. But these weren't colonial-style extraction licenses. They were time-bound, reviewable, and subject to local labor and environmental protections. Third, political alignment. In African forums, trade blocs, and diplomatic circles, Burkina Faso would back Qatar's growing presence not as a client state, but as a regional ally unburdened by Western agendas. This was not just a deal. It was an assertion. Burkina Faso would no longer play by old rules. It would write new ones. But not everyone was pleased. Word of the agreement spread fast, not through official channels, but through alarm bells in Paris and whispers in Washington. For decades, West Africa was seen as a backyard, not a boardroom. Its resources were mapped in Brussels, its contracts written in French, its leaders coached in Washington, D.C. So when a Gulf state with no colonial past and deep financial reserves stepped in quietly, it wasn't seen as innovation. It was seen as intrusion. And yet, it was already happening. While analysts debated the wisdom of Qatar's move, bulldozers arrived in the Sahel. Surveyors marked roads. Engineers drafted blueprints. Small, almost invisible gestures, but they signaled a larger reality Burkina Faso was building again. But this time, not with foreign consultants dictating the terms, with partners who listened. Critics warned of overdependence. They said the country might be swapping one foreign interest for another. But supporters argued something different, that the difference wasn't just in who signs the check, it's in who sets the conditions. And this time, it was Ouagadougou, not Paris. Traoré played his boldest card, not in demanding more, but in demanding differently. He rejected the optics of dependency. No public ribbon cuttings, no donor plaques. Instead, quiet progress. Because this wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a philosophical stance. It said, "We will work with you, but not beneath you." And in that sentence lies the future of African diplomacy. For decades, the continent has been asked to adapt, to adjust, to accept the frameworks designed elsewhere. But this deal hinted at something else, a continent ready to lead its own development, not by excluding the world, but by choosing on its own terms. That's what happened in Doha. Not a bailout, not a handout, a recalibration. And if it holds, it won't just change Burkina Faso. It may inspire others across the Sahel and beyond, from Bamako to Niamey, from Conakry to Accra, to ask for something simple but revolutionary: respect. For months, the story was told in fragments. A road here, a clinic there, an agreement signed in private. But the deeper truth, the one that never made the headlines, was far more profound. This deal between Qatar and Burkina Faso wasn't just about infrastructure. It wasn't just about gold. It was about rewriting the very formula of development that Africa had been handed for decades. At the heart of it was an idea so simple, it sounded radical. What if a nation didn't need to borrow in dollars? Didn't need to pledge its future for a loan today? What if it could trade what it had, its minerals, its geography, its political alignment for what it needed, energy grids, highways, data infrastructure? And what if it did so without the usual gatekeepers? That was the real plan. Not just to bring in investment, but to replace the entire model of IMF-style development with something older barter. Resource swaps. Instead of selling natural gas for cash and then applying for loans, Qatar would trade directly with Burkina Faso. Gold for megawatts, lithium for road networks, political backing in West African blocs for industrial districts built to international standards. It sounds ambitious, but it's already underway. Qatar isn't just pouring money into Burkina Faso's infrastructure. It's securing access, long-term strategic access, to some of the most contested assets in the Sahel. Rare minerals that fuel the world's smartphones, electric vehicles, and satellites. Mining corridors that until recently were controlled by French or Canadian companies. Logistics routes that will soon connect landlocked nations to ports in Ghana or Côte d'Ivoire. And yet, this isn't colonialism dressed in new clothes, at least not yet, because there's one key difference: the negotiating posture. Burkina Faso didn't come begging. Traoré didn't present his country as vulnerable, but as valuable, not in spite of its struggles, but because of how it was rising above them. That posture changed everything. Still, the risks are real. Some worry that this barter-based approach could backfire, that it could create opaque deals without oversight, that it could lock the country into dependencies of a different kind. After all, what happens if political winds in Doha shift? What if global markets crash and Qatar pulls back? Others worry that transparency will suffer, that without multilateral institutions, the public might be left in the dark, that projects could fail without accountability. And most of all, that a foreign benefactor, no matter how friendly, can become a shadow too large to ignore. But here's what's undeniable: this model resonates. In Burkina Faso's towns and villages, people aren't debating macroeconomics. They're watching hospitals go up. They're seeing job sites where there were once idle fields. They're attending schools powered by solar grids that didn't exist a year ago. And that changes something far deeper than GDP. It shifts belief. For too long, development in Africa was synonymous with debt, with waiting, with signing memorandums that never materialized. But this deal, however fragile, is already real in ways that people can see and touch. And it's spreading. Officials in Mali and Niger have reportedly made informal inquiries about similar agreements. Guinea, too, has signaled interest in a Gulf partnership that could rival its long-standing ties with Europe. Even in Ghana, a coastal democracy still balancing East and West, there are whispers in the Ministry of Trade. Because when a landlocked nation with no gas, no coastline, and no global leverage suddenly becomes a case study in sovereign partnership, others take notice. Still, this is where the story complicates. Qatar's motives, however strategic, are not altruistic. The Gulf state is competing not just with France or the US, but with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, China, Turkey, all of whom are seeking influence in Africa's future. For Doha, aligning with Traoré is a statement that it can back not just stable regimes, but bold ones, that it can partner not only where things are easy, but where they are uncertain, volatile, and transformative. So the real question isn't whether Qatar is acting in its interest. Of course it is. The real question is, will Burkina Faso maintain its sovereignty while navigating that interest? That's the tension at the heart of this story. Because if this works, if resource swaps, political alignment, and sovereign contracting can succeed outside Western oversight, it won't just challenge old economic models. It will challenge the narrative that Africa must be saved. That progress comes through permission. That leadership must echo foreign expectations to be legitimate. This is no longer about a gas deal. This is about who gets to write the rules of development and whose voice counts when the future is being negotiated. And Burkina Faso, through one quiet agreement, has just reminded the world it has a voice of its own. It didn't take long. As soon as whispers of the Qatar-Burkina Faso deal reached international ears, something shifted. The silence that had once surrounded West Africa's transformation gave way to murmurs, then warnings, and finally pressure. Paris was the first to react, not with headlines, but with quiet recalibrations. Diplomatic cables began flying. Intelligence briefings suddenly focused not on insurgents in the Sahel, but on engineers from Doha. News outlets sympathetic to European policy started running segments on foreign interference in Burkina Faso. Commentators asked, who is really pulling the strings? Washington followed suit. U.S. State Department officials, already uneasy with the military-led governments in the region, began expressing concern about the nature of the partnership. Behind closed doors, the language was stronger. There were fears that Qatar, a country with its own complex relationships, was providing strategic cover for a bloc of African nations drifting beyond Western reach. They weren't wrong. For decades, West Africa was part of a system. Resources flowed out. Aid and influence flowed in. Military bases, multilateral loans, conditional contracts, all of it carefully managed. Then came Ibrahim Traoré, with no interest in preserving that arrangement. When Burkina Faso pivoted toward Qatar, it was more than a deal. It was a break in the pattern, and breaks demand responses. Multilateral lenders suddenly revisited their terms. Projects long in negotiation were delayed. A regional development package was reassessed for feasibility. Even some humanitarian programs saw funding slow. No official connection was made to the Qatar partnership, but those in Ouagadougou understood the message. If you step outside the circle, don't expect the circle to follow. Yet something remarkable happened. The people didn't flinch. In the markets, the schools, the neighborhoods of Burkina Faso, there was no panic. Instead, there was something closer to resolve. We've lived without much, one teacher said, but at least now we're choosing who we walk with. That choice echoed beyond borders. In Niamey and Bamako in Conakry, leaders began asking similar questions. What if development didn't have to mean dependence? What if investment could come without a lecture? This wasn't rebellion. It was redefinition. And the West knew it. To many policymakers in Europe and North America, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about precedent. Because if one landlocked country could set new terms with a wealthy partner and survive the fallout, others might follow. And not just African countries. The pattern of asymmetric development of debt over dignity was already fraying. Latin America, Southeast Asia, even parts of Eastern Europe were watching. If the Burkina-Qatar model held, it might inspire alternatives to institutions long seen as gatekeepers of global development. That's what made this deal dangerous. Not the money, but the message. A new alignment was emerging. Not East versus West, not democracy versus autocracy, but independence versus inertia. In that light, Traoré's visit to Doha was more than symbolic. It was a diplomatic signal flare, a quiet declaration that the era of unquestioned Western dominance in Africa's economic decisions might be ending not in protest, but in proposition. Still, there is caution in the air. Burkina Faso is not immune to the challenges of balancing sovereignty with survival. And Qatar is not without its own geopolitical interests. But for now, something rare has taken root, an African state negotiating, not from fear, but from purpose. That shift may be quiet. But in the halls of power, it is ringing louder by the day. Because when an empire notices, it often does so, not with bombs, but with silent suggestions and systems built to make you return. And when you don't, they call it risk. But the people of Burkina Faso might call it freedom. In the dimmed rooms of African universities, and think tanks in the crowded buses of Nairobi in WhatsApp groups, from Lagos to Lusaka. One question now floats beneath the noise. What if Burkina Faso is right, not perfect, not finished, but right in how it chose to approach power, in how it reimagined partnership, in how it quietly asked the world to sit down at a new kind of table? That is the strategy worth examining, because this isn't about a contract in Doha. It's about a principle emerging from the dust of broken promises. For decades, the African continent has operated under a system that promised development, but often delivered dependency. That offered loans, but demanded loyalty. That provided aid, but extracted agency. Ibrahim Traoré, young unpolished, often criticized, has not simply rejected that system. He's restructured the conversation, not alone, but with clarity. What does his approach teach? First, posture matters. By entering negotiations, not as a client, but as a counterpart, Burkina Faso set a precedent. It reminded Africa and the world that legitimacy is not something handed out by global institutions. It's earned at home through credibility with your people. That alone changes the dynamics. Second, timing is everything. Traoré's pivot came at a moment when global energy politics are in flux. Europe is searching for new partners. Gulf states are expanding influence. African nations are increasingly aware of their leverage, not just in resources, but in geography, population, and position. Qatar's move wasn't philanthropy, it was strategy. But so was Traoré's. He positioned Burkina Faso not as a prize, but as a platform, a hub for regional development, a connector in a rising Sahelian alliance, and a willing partner in new forms of exchange. That's why others are watching. Mali, Niger, Guinea. These nations aren't just sharing military visions, they're exploring shared economic futures. If Burkina Faso becomes a functional case study in sovereign negotiation, it could serve as a prototype for post-Western development pathways across the continent. But the lesson isn't copy Doha. The deeper lesson is that Africa must articulate its own terms with anyone. Whether it's Qatar or China, the US or Turkey, no external partner can define the destiny of a continent unless that continent stops believing in its own. That's where the strategy becomes deeper than politics. It becomes cultural. Across generations, Africans have been taught, sometimes subtly, sometimes brutally, that development is a gift. That growth must be managed from outside. That stability requires foreign guarantees. Traoré's partnership with Qatar Controversial Complex disrupts that idea. By negotiating for infrastructure in return for minerals, by demanding jobs for locals and long-term investment frameworks, his government has challenged the myth that Africa must wait in line. It says, build with us or step aside. Still, this strategy has its critics. Some warn that new dependencies are simply replacing old ones. That Gulf money, no matter how quiet, comes with influence. That sovereignty once negotiated can be eroded by silence and subtle control. These are valid concerns, and they deserve scrutiny. But here's the counterpoint. Every nation on Earth balances interests. Every alliance is a calculation. The difference is who sets the terms and whether the people being governed have a say. Burkina Faso's model at its best suggests a future where African nations no longer operate as recipients, but as architects, where strategic alignment is not sold, but shared, where development deals are not one-size-fits-all, but rooted in context and history, in dignity, in the honest needs of a rising generation. That vision isn't naive, it's overdue. Africa's youth are not just dreaming of jobs, they're dreaming of autonomy, of governments that negotiate boldly, of leaders who believe the continent deserves not pity, but parity. That's the strategy Traoré is betting on. And it's a high-stakes gamble because if it fails, critics will call it proof that independence doesn't work, that Africa still needs supervision, that sovereignty is too idealistic. But if it succeeds even partially, It could become a blueprint, one where the IMF isn't the only lender, where development doesn't come with forced reforms, where aid is not traded for silence, where the next generation grows up believing that their governments don't have to kneel to lead. That's what's at stake. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about the continent asking itself a simple, powerful question. What if we stopped asking permission? If you marched for peace? If you questioned the wars fought in your name? If you remember Watergate COINTELPRO or the long shadow of Vietnam? Then you understand what it means to be lied to and what it means to demand better. This story about Burkina Faso and Qatar is not about perfection. It is not about heroes or villains. It is about choices, the kind that shape nations, the kind that history will judge by their consequences, not their press releases. A landlocked African country, long dismissed as poor and peripheral, chose to look power in the eye and ask, what if we wrote our own rules? And a Gulf state, long overlooked as just another oil-rich monarchy, answered, let's see. That moment matters, not because it will save the world, but because it reminds us that small nations, when led by those who serve rather than sell, can still change the conversation. It reminds us that justice is not a slogan. It's a negotiation. And maybe it reminds us that Africa is not rising because someone allowed it to. Africa is rising because it decided to. If you still believe in justice, not just for your country, but for the world we all inherit, then now is the time to pay attention. Because the next chapter won't be televised, but it will be written, and it will be read by those not yet born.